At 9:01 a.m. London time, the monarchy released a cold-blooded decree that sent shock waves around the world. For the first time in modern history, two royal children were officially removed from the line of succession, and the silence that followed was more deafening than any scandal. Meghan Markle, once the bold disruptor of palace tradition, now found herself publicly humiliated. But what came next? No one saw coming. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The statement itself was calm, almost surgical in its tone, but its impact was devastating. There was no apology, no cushioning language, no ceremonial softness, just a declaration of fact. Archie Harrison and Lilibet Diana were no longer recognized within the royal line of succession. No debate, no pause, no room for negotiation. In a single stroke, centuries of inherited assumption were replaced with cold constitutional enforcement. Inside Buckingham Palace, advisors described the atmosphere as unnervingly quiet. This was not a family argument spilling into public view. This was a monarchy acting as an institution, not a household. The decree cited updated eligibility requirements emphasizing full-time residency within the United Kingdom, direct sovereign oversight, and the expectation of active royal duty. The message was unmistakable. Birth alone was no longer enough. Within minutes, global media outlets scrambled to interpret what many were already calling a quiet coup. Royal correspondents who had covered the palace for decades admitted they had never seen such a decisive move delivered with such emotional detachment. Political analysts warned this was not merely symbolic. It was structural, the kind of action taken only when the crown feels cornered. Meghan's camp, according to multiple insiders, was completely blindsided. There had been no advanced briefing, no private warning, no opportunity to prepare a counter-narrative. Phones rang unanswered. Lawyers demanded clarification that never came. For the first time since stepping away from royal life, Meghan was reacting rather than controlling the moment. Behind closed doors, whispers spread rapidly. This did not feel like a spontaneous decision. It felt planned, calculated. The culmination of something brewing quietly for years. Staff members spoke in hushed tones about long-simmering tensions, unresolved disputes, and warnings that had been ignored until they could no longer be contained. Public reactions split sharply. Some saw cruelty, others saw necessity, but nearly everyone sensed the same thing. This was not the end of a story. It was the opening strike of a far larger confrontation. A confrontation that would not remain confined to press releases and palace walls. Because as shocking as the announcement was, seasoned observers knew the monarchy never moves without preparation. And if the crown was willing to remove children from succession in broad daylight, then something far more explosive had already happened in the shadows. But beneath the surface of this brutal declaration lay something far more dangerous. A private directive signed hours earlier by King Charles that would unravel everything Meghan had fought for. Before the public even had time to react, palace insiders leaked the existence of a second hidden document. One that rewrote the rules of blood, duty, and legitimacy. Signed by King Charles himself, it demanded what no royal had ever officially requested in modern history: proof of lineage. And this time, the crown wasn't asking for forgiveness. This hidden document wasn't part of the morning's public announcement. It was drafted in silence, reviewed behind heavy palace doors, and signed at precisely 7:42 a.m. Less than 2 hours before the monarchy dropped its public hammer. On the surface, it was a calm administrative directive. But for those who knew what it really meant, it was an earthquake waiting to rupture the very roots of royal bloodlines. The clause buried within activated and near-forgotten constitutional power, one not exercised in the last century, a formal right to demand verification of lineage from any claimant to inheritance or titles, should doubt arise. Charles's signature wasn't just ink on parchment. It was a trigger. The clause invoked a rarely mentioned article tucked deep within royal succession law, one that allowed the sovereign to question inheritance claims in moments of legal uncertainty. It authorized what insiders called the Clarity Review, a forensic institutional review of birth legitimacy. And while the official language was diplomatic, its implications were brutal. It meant that Archie and Lilibet's place in the line of succession hinged not on tradition, but on proof. For Meghan, the clause struck at the heart of everything she'd fought to secure. Royal historians were stunned. This hasn't happened since pre-Elizabethan times, one expert confessed. The crown had always moved cautiously around issues of birth and blood. But this time, the gloves were off. Meghan's decision to challenge inheritance rules had backfired spectacularly. By opening the door to debate, she had unknowingly given the palace the legal right to demand answers she may never have wanted to provide. And those answers now required more than narrative. They required DNA. The palace made no immediate public comment. But behind the scenes, strategic moves were already underway. Private consultations with constitutional lawyers, meetings with the royal archives, requests for documents long buried in secure vaults. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a sovereign investigation carried out with clinical precision and zero tolerance for sentiment. And the target was unmistakable. Meghan's children, Archie and Lilibet, were the ones under review. Though the official wording remained neutral, the implications screamed louder than any press release. The monarchy was preparing to challenge the very foundation of their inclusion in royal heritage. Not because of gossip, but because of inconsistency. Old questions that had been whispered for years about birth certificates, hospital records, protocol breaches were suddenly thrust into the center of a constitutional firestorm. The timing was no coincidence. Sources say that Meghan's renewed legal push for equal inheritance recognition had triggered alarms inside the Privy Council, and Charles, no longer willing to delay difficult decisions, acted with finality. There was no going back now. The Clarity Review was alive. The rules had changed. The monarchy had officially declared that sentiment was no longer protection and ambiguity was no longer tolerable. And as the royal establishment closed ranks, one voice emerged louder and sharper than them all. Princess Anne, the monarchy's iron enforcer, who refused to tolerate another ounce of ambiguity. In a room of titled silence, Princess Anne shattered the atmosphere with a single spine-chilling sentence. If legitimacy is your argument, then legitimacy must be proven. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a verdict, and it marked the beginning of the end for Meghan's royal claim. The tension in the Privy Purse chamber was already high when Meghan's legal team attempted to reopen talks regarding the children's inheritance eligibility. But it was Anne's response that detonated like a royal thunderclap. She wasn't there to negotiate. She was there to protect the crown. And in less than a minute, she flipped the entire power dynamic. Those who expected her to tread lightly were wrong, and didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words carried the weight of centuries, and every person in that room knew it. When Meghan's representatives argued that royal children born abroad should be acknowledged without bias, and cut them down with calm, devastating precision, she laid out what insiders now called the Grey File, a personal dossier she had compiled over 7 years. Dates, signatures, photographs, protocols ignored, hospital logs that didn't align, and multiple administrative anomalies. The inconsistencies were no longer rumors. They were evidence. Anne didn't just suggest the palace had a right to question. She demanded it. Every moment of that confrontation shifted the monarchy's posture. Gone was the diplomatic restraint. In its place stood the cold force of constitutional law. Meghan, caught off guard, reportedly tried to pivot, insisting the doubts were rooted in discrimination, not logic. But Anne didn't flinch. She ignored the emotional bait. The monarchy, she said, is not dictated by feelings. It is protected by facts. No one interrupted her. Not even Charles. Not even the lawyers. And Harry, once the loudest voice in Meghan's defense, remained silent. According to one senior aide, his face was blank, not angry, not defensive, just empty. For years, he had defended her against every assault, every headline, every accusation. But in that room, as Anne read off a series of critical registration inconsistencies, something in Harry fractured. Meghan, meanwhile, tried to regain control. She questioned Anne's authority. She argued precedent. She tried to steer the conversation toward privacy rights, but Anne refused to yield. She didn't need permission to demand answers. She had constitutional obligation. And with the monarch's support behind her, Her authority was absolute. It wasn't Justin's words that left the room reeling. It was what they represented, a royal willing to make enemies within her own family for the sake of the institution. An enforcer who carried no crown but commanded more respect than many who did. Even palace veterans admitted afterward they had never seen and unleash such fire. It wasn't personal. It was preservation. Behind closed doors, senior advisors began reshuffling the palace's legal calendar that very night. The Clarity Review would now move forward, not in theory, but in full force. Every refusal Meghan had issued in prior years, every document not filed, every verification skipped, would now be weaponized against her. And all because and had given the monarchy its spine back. But this wasn't just a royal scolding. Princess Anne's challenge triggered a chain reaction that reached all the way to Prince William himself. He had always stayed silent, avoided the drama. But when Anne laid bare the cracks in the palace's foundation, Prince William delivered a chilling ultimatum. I will not inherit instability. With that, the future king cast his weight behind the most aggressive royal audit in modern history. For years, William had taken the high road, refusing to be drawn into the mudslinging wars that had plagued the palace since Harry and Meghan's departure. He'd watched his father hesitate, watched the monarchy bend to accommodate optics, and watched the press twist every hesitation into weakness. But when Princess Anne pulled the curtain back and exposed the quiet chaos threatening the crown's future, William saw the writing on the wall. Silence was no longer neutrality. It was complicity. And he would not stand by and inherit a legacy built on uncertainty. In a private council meeting that took place just hours after Anne's damning remarks, William rose and spoke with a precision that stunned even his staunchest allies. Meghan does not decide the future of my children, he said, voice unwavering. The throne will not be passed through ambiguity. With those words, he officially backed the Clarity Review, not just in spirit, but in full legal force. He signed off on a new clause that granted the palace the authority to remove royal titles if lineage could not be verified. A line that had once been political suicide had now become a constitutional safeguard, and William made sure it bore his name. Behind closed doors, a rare alliance formed. William and Anne, often seen as polar opposites in demeanor and public engagement, became the monarchy's immovable front. Together, they crafted a legal strategy that would not just review Meghan's claims, but dissect them layer by layer, file by file. And while Meghan's defenders scrambled to reposition their narrative, they quickly realized the tide had shifted. No longer was this a palace trying to suppress a rogue duchess. This was the institution reasserting its control. William didn't seek media attention. He didn't leak statements or engage in shadowy spin. Instead, he worked the levers of power from within. He strengthened the palace's internal legal arm, ensured archival compliance, and granted full access to the royal succession records, an unprecedented move that signaled full endorsement of her findings. Advisors noticed the change immediately. William, once a quiet reformer, was now a strategist in full command of the royal chessboard. The message was unmistakable. The future king would not gamble with a monarchy's survival for the sake of familial sentiment. He had chosen stability over scandal, lineage over loyalty, and truth over tolerance. And in doing so, he planted the seeds of institutional isolation around Meghan that would grow with ruthless speed. Yet no shift was more haunting than the silence that followed from Harry. A silence not of defiance, but of doubt that cracked the very soul of his once unwavering loyalty. For the first time, Prince Harry didn't look at Meghan when the allegations were read. He stayed at the table. According to witnesses, it was the look of a man doing math he never wanted to do. The man who once abandoned his crown now wondered if the cost had been too high. In that dimly lit chamber where the fate of royal legacy was being recalculated, Harry sat motionless. No defense, no fury, just silence that screamed louder than any denial as and laid out the inconsistencies, and William backed the inquiry without flinching. Harry remained utterly still, like a man watching a storm he no longer had the strength to outrun. For years, he had been Meghan's fiercest shield. He took the hits, fought the press, burned bridges that once connected him to tradition. But now the question wasn't whether he believed in her. It was whether he still understood her. Meghan, sensing the shift, leaned in. She tried to re-engage him with urgency, frustration, even desperation. She pressed for him to speak up, to counter the accusations, to challenge the review. But Harry didn't move. His silence wasn't passive. It was devastating. For those who saw it firsthand, it wasn't just emotional fatigue. It was doubt. The kind of doubt that unravels the foundation of trust. And once it takes root, it grows like poison. Later that evening, Harry made a private request that stunned the palace. He asked for independent access to the Clarity Review findings separate from Meghan's legal team. The message was clear. He no longer wanted filtered explanations. He wanted the truth unshaped by her voice or her strategy. It was the first formal indication that he was breaking rank, not just from his wife, but from the story they had built together. Behind closed doors, the fractures widened. Multiple sources confirmed intense private confrontations between Harry and Meghan. Arguments that left her shaken and him emotionally gutted. One aide overheard Harry whisper to a longtime confidant, "I don't know what's true anymore." It wasn't a confession. It was a collapse. A royal prince who had given up everything to protect his new life now stood in the rubble of a reality he was beginning to question. The emotional toll began to seep into the halls of the palace. Staff members who had once avoided eye contact with the Sussexes now exchanged worried glances. Meghan's fury was no longer aimed at the monarchy. It was turning inward. And Harry, once defiant and resolute, walked the corridors of power with his head bowed, weighed down by the possibility that he had defended a legacy built on sand. The divide between them wasn't speculation anymore. It was visible, it was raw, and it was irreversible. The more Meghan pushed, the more Harry retreated, not to the monarchy, but to clarity. And then came the moment the palace had dreaded, but and had long predicted. The monarchy prepared to demand DNA proof. It was a monarchy's nuclear option, and it had never been used. But now, under Princess Anne's command, the Crown formally requested DNA confirmation from Meghan Markle to validate the royal status of Archie and Lilibet. This wasn't just a test. It was an execution warrant cloaked in legal terminology. The request was issued not with spectacle, but with precision. The palace legal team delivered a formal notice invoking a long-dormant clause reserved for moments of extreme constitutional ambiguity. The basis, a tightly sealed internal memo documenting a disturbing string of inconsistencies stretching from 2018 to 2024, discrepancies involving birth records, international registration timelines, unexplained delays, and a repeated failure to comply with standard royal verification protocols. What once had been dismissed as tabloid noise was now evidence in a sovereign-level inquiry. Within hours of receiving the notice, Meghan's response came swift and fierce. She refused. She cited privacy. She accused the monarchy of cruelty, discrimination, and targeting. She described the demand as invasive and unconstitutional. But none of it stopped the machinery that had already been set into motion. Her refusal didn't stall the process. It accelerated it. Because in the royal system, refusal to verify is not interpreted as innocence. It is seen as obstruction. The moment Meghan declined, a secondary clause was triggered, one that authorized the immediate review of her children's titles. Overnight, Archie and Lilibet's positions were suspended, pending outcome. Meghan had hoped to shield them by stalling, but instead she opened the gates to something far more dangerous. Permanent exclusion by default. Princess Anne, who had remained resolute since the very beginning, doubled down in a confidential session attended by senior legal figures. She delivered the line that would define the palace's posture from that point on. Doubt is not an insult. It's a threat. No royal, she declared, was immune to scrutiny, not even those born under the glow of international fascination. The monarchy did not exist to please the public. It existed to preserve history, and history had no space for ambiguity. King Charles, meanwhile, was not silent. After weeks of deliberation and growing tension, he officially signed off on the compulsory verification clause. The move wasn't symbolic. It was structural. With one signature, the monarch redefined the boundaries of eligibility, tethering lineage not to belief or public narrative, but to forensic certainty. The palace would no longer be held hostage by speculation. It would demand truth, even if it meant cutting off branches of its own family tree. And for Meghan, the walls began closing in. Every route she had used to negotiate, deflect, or delay was now sealed. The narrative was no longer hers to control. The monarchy had taken back its power, and it was using it with clinical precision. With Meghan cornered and Harry crumbling, the final blow came not from a palace insider, but from the monarchy's own constitutional protocol. The document landed on Charles's desk under seal. Inside, a 3-sentence summary changed everything. It concluded what the monarchy had suspected all along. The children's documentation was non-verifiable under succession law. For Meghan, it was the moment her entire royal strategy collapsed. The Clarity Review was never meant to make headlines. It was designed to uncover the truth quietly, precisely, and without emotional interference. But what it uncovered didn't require dramatics. It required judgment. The report's language was stark. Missing verification steps, incomplete documentation, unexplained delays in filing, and a consistent refusal to comply with constitutional requirements. In short, it found that Archie and Lilibet could not be legally recognized as heirs to the throne under the newly ratified 2025 protocols. Each inconsistency Meghan's camp once dismissed as trivial was now systematically documented, footnoted, and time-stamped. Emails showed she had declined the palace's request for standard birth confirmation procedures, not once, but multiple times. Registration anomalies, location conflicts, omitted medical sign-offs, and most damning of all, no DNA submission. Under the revised rules, that refusal equated to one outcome: disqualification. Harry was among the first to receive the findings in private. Sources close to the palace say he didn't speak for several minutes after reading it. He sat with the folder in his lap, unmoving, as the weight of its contents sank into him. For years, he had fought to protect a future he believed in. But this wasn't just a ruling. It was a reckoning, and it brought with it the unbearable realization that the narrative he had clung to might have been built on a lie he never chose. In the days that followed, Harry withdrew further. Communication between him and Meghan became fractured. What had once been united resolve began to look like estrangement. He didn't rage. He didn't fight back. Instead, he asked for space, and for the first time since their departure from royal duties, he asked to speak to William privately. Meanwhile, William was not hesitating. With the Clarity Review finalized, he authorized the palace to move forward with a public declaration. The world, he said, needed to know that the Crown would no longer tolerate institutional uncertainty, and agreed. In a meeting with the Lord Chancellor and the King, she placed a final recommendation on the table. It contained only 4 words: "Let the matter end." King Charles nodded. He had seen enough. The palace had been more than patient. The law had spoken, and now the monarchy would act not out of malice, but out of necessity. As the clock struck 6 p.m. in London, the world braced for a broadcast that would echo across centuries of royal legacy. Dressed in full regalia, King Charles stood before the nation to deliver the most consequential royal address since Queen Elizabeth's passing. With calm finality, he announced that Archie and Lilibet were no longer in the line of succession. 2 names erased, 1 legacy protected. The air was still, but the gravity was thunderous. King Charles began not with emotion, but with clarity. He spoke of duty, how it must be demonstrated, not claimed, of legacy, that it must be built on certainty, not controversy, and of the Crown itself, an institution too ancient, too sacred to be reshaped by personal narratives or public pressure. The protocols, he explained, had been updated for a modern monarchy. Residency in the United Kingdom, participation in royal duty, and full verification of lineage were now mandatory requirements for succession. These were not personal conditions. They were constitutional. Without ever naming Meghan directly, Charles rendered her campaign irrelevant. He spoke as a monarch, not a father or grandfather. And when he confirmed that Master Archie Harrison, Mountbatten Windsor, and Miss Lilibet Diana, Mountbatten Windsor, no longer satisfied the requirements to remain in the royal line, the weight of history pressed down like stone. The royal website was updated within minutes. The official registry followed shortly after. Their names were removed without fanfare, quietly, permanently. But it was William's words that dominated the headlines the next day. A single phrase included in the address by his insistence. Instability must not be inherited. It became a rallying cry, a declaration that the next generation of royals would not be burdened by the chaos of the last. William had drawn the line firm, final, and immovable. In California, Meghan's media strategy crumbled under the weight of silence. She attempted to frame the broadcast as political revenge, as targeted harassment, as unjust exile. But something had shifted. News outlets, once eager to amplify her perspective, now demanded documentation. They asked for proof, verification, answers. Meghan had none to give. Inside Monteito, Harry watched the address alone. According to a source close to the Sussex household, he didn't argue. He didn't cry. He simply whispered one sentence that would haunt the walls of their estate for years. None of this would have happened if you told me the truth. The heartbreak wasn't in the loss of royal status. It was in the loss of trust. As public reaction swelled, the palace issued a single final statement to all media networks. It was short, clinical, and devastating. The Duchess of Sussex has declined all opportunities to provide verification. The matter is therefore considered closed. That word closed rang with the finality of a sealed vault. No further appeals, no extended negotiations, no backroom deals. The door was shut. But even as the ink dried on history, the emotional aftermath within the monarchy and the Sussex household was just beginning. With the titles gone and the lines severed, Meghan found herself exiled not by geography, but by legitimacy. Her last weapon, the children's royal future, had been neutralized. And inside the palace, the silence was not of celebration, but of survival. For Meghan, the loss wasn't just political. It was existential. Her identity had been entwined with the royal institution from the moment she walked into it. Even after stepping away, she leveraged that association to build a brand, a voice, a platform. But now, the very foundation of that power had crumbled. Her public statements lost traction. Her interviews drew skepticism. Media allies who once defended her narrative began retreating, demanding answers she could no longer provide. The shift was sudden, brutal, and irreversible. Without the leverage of succession, her narrative was no longer feared. It was questioned. Inside Buckingham Palace, the storm had passed, but not without leaving cracks in every wall. Harry, though no longer fighting, had not returned. He requested long-term access to the Clarity Archive, an unprecedented move from someone who once renounced the institution entirely. Some viewed it as a sign of reconciliation. Others saw it as quiet grief, the need to understand how things had spiraled so far beyond his control. He didn't speak publicly. He didn't defend Meghan. He didn't object to the ruling. That silence, once interpreted as loyalty, now felt like absence. Meanwhile, a new royal structure was beginning to solidify. William stood at the center of it, unshaken, decisive, and finally unchallenged. His stance on clarity over convenience had earned him the respect of Parliament, the admiration of advisers, and the confidence of the British public. Where Charles had hesitated, William had struck. He was no longer just the heir. He was the anchor. Anne's role became equally undeniable. Her vigilance, her refusal to ignore inconsistencies, her ruthless protection of tradition. It had reshaped the institution itself. Those who once saw her as a peripheral figure now referred to her as the monarchy's constitutional guardian. She had proven that restraint was not weakness, and that loyalty to the crown sometimes meant confronting those closest to it. And Charles, the monarch who had signed the final directive, was viewed through a more complex lens. Some saw him as a father who had acted too late, others as a sovereign who had acted just in time. He bore the cost of every decision, not just as king, but as the man who had allowed this storm to build for far too long. His legacy would not be one of peace, but of preservation. As for Meghan, she retreated from the public eye. No new interviews, no official statements. Legal experts began speculating on potential lawsuits or privacy challenges, but no action came, only silence. Whether it was strategic or emotional, No one could say. But her silence no longer controlled the narrative. It surrendered to it. And inside the palace, something new had taken root. A quiet but unmistakable unity. Not of emotion, but of principle. The crown had chosen clarity over sentiment, process over pressure, and legacy over noise. It had drawn a line and enforced it without flinching. In the end, Meghan had challenged the system, and the system didn't just push back, it erased the future she built. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next.